Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today, I'm joined by Bob Gerard, a learning industry professional with over 30 years of experience. At Accenture, he leads the Learning Ingenuity team within the Human Resources organization, focusing on research and development to enhance employee learning. In today's episode, we'll explore how to measure training effectiveness, ways to integrate learning into daily work, and proven ways to leverage neuroscience to enhance skill development. We'll also discuss how to make training stick and ensure employees retain what they have learned. So if you've ever wondered how to make learning more effective, engaging, and measurable, then this episode is for you. Enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Love for our listeners to learn more about you. So my first question is always, let our listeners learn more about your background and really what got you interested in this work.
Yeah, really good question. So I was a computer science major in college. That whole journey actually started in 1977 when I saw Star Wars for the first time, and that will not be my only Star Wars reference today, I'm sure. Um, but when I saw Star Wars the first time and got fascinated by the idea of robotics and computers and decided I wanted to be a computer programmer. So that was kind of my journey. Went to the University of Illinois and majored in computer science. And I realized when I was there that I was just getting middling grades in my programming classes, but I was getting A's in all of my English classes that I was taking for electives. So it's like, well, what can I do with this? And at Illinois at the time, it still might be this way now. You had to take a minor in whatever you plan to apply computer science to. So I said, well, what if I do technical writing and then my job can be to write books and manuals and documentation? And that program didn't exist. So I found a professor who was willing to invent that with me. And I was the first person to do that. Well, back in the late 80s, there were not a lot of computer scientists who actually wanted to write documentation. So that landed me a job at Anderson Consulting, which later became Accenture right out of school. And that was the plan. I was going to be writing documentation, but it turned out that the team who wrote documentation also had to write training courses. And the team that wrote the training courses also had to teach the pilots. And that's where I discovered really my passion was stand-up training. And so I did that for a number of years and then basically evolved and kind of have had every role that you can imagine in the corporate learning field, both in terms of design and delivery and development. The role that I'm in right now, Learning Ingenuity, really kind of started back in 1999 when you might remember these days, there was this crazy new thing called the internet. And one of the things that they were talking about doing with this internet thing was called a learning management system, where the learning would be online and you'd register for courses online and all that kind of stuff. So a team was pulled together to create the very first LMS for Accenture. We called it My Learning. And that was kind of the origin of my team. And so many, many years later, I lead that team now. We like to call ourselves research and development for how Accenture people can learn better. So we're mostly focused internally on our own people. Lots of times the stuff that we do, we then wind up offering to our clients because what's good enough for us is also good enough for our clients. And so that's pretty exciting. But that's what we do. We try to figure out new ways for people to learn, figure out how effective they are and how efficient they are, and then make those things happen.
That's great insight, and that sounds like my dream job as well. I mean, so excited to unpack that with you today. And Accenture invests over $1 billion annually in learning and professional development, making it one of the largest corporate investors in workforce education. Can you elaborate on how this investment has really transformed the learning culture within the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a non-answer, but then we can dig into it. The non-answer is that level of investment hasn't really impacted the learning culture that much because we've always had a very, very strong learning culture. From the very moment that I started, when I started back in 1989, we went to a back room in an office in Chicago, myself and the 15, I think, or so other people that we all started on the same day. And we spent 3 weeks learning COBOL programming out of books, out of manuals, only touched a computer once during that whole time. I had a computer science degree, but I'd never touched COBOL. So, it was an interesting learning experience for me with that. But then we got sent to our global training center in St. Charles, Illinois for a 3 week long boot camp, working 8 a.m. till 10 p.m. every day for 3 weeks. You got half day on Saturday and a half day on Sunday. And it was one of the most amazing experiences I ever had in my life. As a lot of people say, it was a fantastic experience that they would never ever want to do again. But it was transformative for me. And again, that's part of what made me realize I love training and I love corporate education and how that works. So it's always been a part of our culture. The number of people who are old timers like me that tell the story, I came to Accenture because I just planned to be there for a couple of years and learn some stuff because, there's so much about learning and education, get that on my resume and then move on. And I'm still here 15, 20, 30 years later. Tons of those stories. It really gets highlighted, though. Our chief executive officer, Julie Sweet, is a passionate learner. She is addicted to learning. It's very important to her. And she was actually in an interview I saw just a couple of weeks ago where she mentioned that when she's interviewing new executives to work for her, one of the things that she asks is, what have you learned in the last 6 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 months? I'm not sure. But what have you been learning? And if they're not able to respond to that, it's an indicator to her that there might be a culture gap because people at Accenture are passionate about learning. This is just really, really, really what we do. So, to get to a little bit more satisfying answer to your question of, what's the impact of the $1 billion? Uh, that's it. It's one of those things where I feel like we would do it regardless because it's the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do to invest in people and help them learn. But for Accenture, because really our only product is our people, right? Like we're a large global professional services company. We do a lot of consulting, a lot of technology consulting. What we have to offer is a bunch of very smart people, very dedicated people, and the ability for them to help you with your business and help solve your problems. And so we do have a culture of being highly trained up front and also being able to learn on the ground as new things come up. But it's not just that it's the right thing to do. It really is the way we look at developing our product is by investing in developing them as individuals and as professionals. And that's where the $1 billion goes.
Love that answer. And it's so critical. You're right. Getting senior level support, which it sounds like you do, and integrating it within the overall framework of the company, realizing that they're not two separate things, but they're really inextricably tied together if you want to have an impact and if you want to, build out that mission and that vision that Accenture has over time in really supporting the learning directives of its employees. And a lot of companies have that learning focus, but they fail to connect the skills development to real business outcomes. How does Accenture really measure the impact of advanced learning technologies on employee skill development or even on the overall business performance? Because as we know with the Kirkpatrick model, the level 3, the level 4 has always been the most difficult and most challenging for any learning department to get at. But talk to me about kind of how you address those issues.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and you're right. I mean, measuring the impact and connecting it back to business results is so important, and it's so hard. I long for it just to be a binary thing, like the Matrix. Plug in the tape, and I know kung fu. You've got it right, and then you can demonstrate you know it 5 seconds later if you're Keanu Reeves. I wish it was that simple, but it's just not. There's unfortunately no way to, even after a learning experience, to have an MRI of somebody's brain to figure out what really really soaked in. You can get to some level of that with knowledge assessments and pre-tests and post-tests to figure out, do they remember the facts? But again, just because somebody remembers what you taught them in a learning course doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to remember that 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later, and let alone that they're going to effectively apply it, right? Will the knowledge result in actually building the skills? And then will the skills that they have gained result in the behaviors that you need to move forward? Now, one of the things that is I am noticing across the industry that I am so excited about and also challenged by is that it feels like everybody is finally starting to glom on to this idea that learning corporate education is not just about doing corporate education. The fundamental goal of it is you've got some business outcomes that you're going for. To make those happen, your people need to change behaviors in one way or another. They need to do something different that is going to change your company. And the value of learning comes in that. The most value in learning comes in that, of making that happen. You talked about Kirkpatrick's scale, and at ATD last year, I was in a session with Jim Kirkpatrick, and Jim raised the idea that we should stop calling ourselves learning and development. We should call ourselves performance, learning and performance. And I love that idea. I'm passionate about that idea. So it's good that we're starting to think about that as an industry, but still it's hard. It's hard to measure. It's hard to figure that out. And we have tried different approaches over the years, some to better success or less success. One of the things that my team is currently working on now, though, is a new framework that we developed to help really answer those questions. We call it the SCAI framework. SCAI is SKAI, and that stands for satisfaction, knowledge, application, and impact. So the idea around this is you always start with the business outcomes, right? So, this happens to me. I don't know if this happens to everybody across my industry, but it happens to me a lot, right? Like, we'll get a call from a business leader and they will say, "Hey, we need you to develop a training class for me about topic XYZ." And historically, we and a lot of people might have said, "Okay, great. Like, let's just figure that out and make it happen." The focus here is, okay, let's actually start with the business outcomes that you're looking for. What are the results you're looking for? Where are you looking to push the needle? What are the specific metrics that we're going to use to know whether we're successful or not? And so if we start by setting up that dashboard, then we say, okay, now we can know, are we having the results that we are looking for? We can use different levels of assessment to figure out what really did the learning do to impact the shifting of those needles. So S, satisfaction, that's what we think. It's smile sheets, right? It's what did you think of the learning? But we are focusing, as I realize a lot of my peers are now using more of a net promoter score as a really good indicator of satisfaction. So if you ask somebody, would you recommend this to your friend or colleague who is in the same boat as you, that really helps you understand more. Did this deliver from the point of view of the learner? That's that. K stands for knowledge. That mostly comes through pre-assessments, post-assessments, pretty straightforward. A stands for application. So now with application, we're getting into, let's loop back with them afterwards and figure out, hey, did you actually apply what you learned in the training class back on the job? And what were the results? Tell us some stories about that so we can do a little bit of qualitative evidence to help us understand what the application is. Also, we're going back to their supervisors, right? Hey, 3 months after you send Tom to that class, would you send one of his peers to that class who had a similar performance concern? That tells us a lot about, were they able to come back and apply and actually be successful with it? And then the I of impact is really digging in and kind of doing a deep data science dive on, okay, let's look at like the group of people who went through the training and a control group of people who didn't go through their training and measure their exact performance against those business results that we were looking at the top. So that's the SCAI framework. Now, what's exciting about this is if you heard me run through like the S and the K and the A and the I, and you thought, wow, that sounds like a lot of work. That sounds like it would be very expensive to get to that. The answer is absolutely. It totally is. So you don't do that for everything. If you start off with that dashboard where you're saying, okay, we're trying to get these business outcomes, and did we do that? Did we shift the needle the way we wanted to do that? Great. We've got a readout of that. Now, what the SCAI framework does is it helps us say the impact that the learning experience had on those metrics with more or less level of confidence. So if it's a smaller program, we might say, hey, you know what? As a result of this, it looks like the sales numbers hit the metric that you were looking for. We've got satisfaction scores come back that people said that, yeah, they would recommend their course to other people. So we would say with probably like a 60% level of security, of confidence, that the training had the impact that you wanted it to make. If you go the whole 9 yards of the SCAI, which we're only going to be reserving for our really big, really expensive, high profile, high attendance learning experiences. If you go through that SCAI, then we're saying, well, now we're telling you with like 90 to 95% confidence of what the impact of the learning experience was on your business metrics. But it all comes back to the business metrics. We want to be able to say, hey, the metrics are going in the right direction, but we're looking at the training and we don't really think that it's having that much of an impact. So we need to make some changes to the training so that your metrics can get even better, right? It's probably other factors that were causing the needle to shift the way you wanted it to do. We want to be able to say that. But then the flip side of that is where it gets snarky, is we also want to be able to say, if we have to, hey, we notice that the needles are not moving in the direction that you want. They're actually going the opposite direction. But don't blame the training, because when we look at the training, right, it looks like we're delivering what you asked us to do, what we said that we needed to do. So it must be some other factor that we need to look at to actually make those needles shift the way you want them to do.
Well, that's an important distinction too, because I think training is usually the default solution to a lot of performance issues, and it's only a solution, the right solution, to a select few, where the environment, motivation, other things that are outside of the learning and development role really needs to be accounted for, right, and addressed if the learning outcome is going to be successful. Even when training is the right outcome, I would argue if the environment and the accountability and other factors aren't at play and aligned with the training outcomes, it's not going to have the intended impact that the company's hoping for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a lot of people outside of the learning organization view learning as the easy button. Like you said, like, I've got a problem. Oh, got to train my people. Boom. That also makes it an easy scapegoat if they don't get the results they want. So it's not just about defending ourselves. It's all about, like, we're one big company. We're trying to get to the same results. So let's figure out, are we getting there, and what do we need to tweak in order to really make the difference and get the results we're looking for?
Well, and our mutual friend, Dr. Paul Zak, you've also used his Immersion Neuroscience to track attention and emotional engagement in learning. What results have you seen from this collaboration?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like you said, Paul introduced us. So thanks to Paul. He's a good friend and a good colleague. I'm trying to remember when I first met him. I want to say it was about 10 years ago. Another mutual friend brought a whole bunch of people together and it's like, hey, you guys should meet Paul. And he did a demo of his technology. And he he strapped a fitness sensor on my arm, and then he showed me a public service announcement type TV advertisement, which was very well done. And it was like I was watching it, and at first I was a little bit bored, and then something happened that kind of touched my heartstrings, and I felt like engaged with it, more pulled in, and got a little bit emotional. I cry at Kleenex commercials, so it really, really hit me. So I watched this thing, and then Paul pulls up my graph, that came out of his technology, and he's able to say, well, this is where your engagement was down and you were a little bit bored, but over here is where it peaked and we got your emotions and this is where you were so engaged and so immersed that you decided you were going to take action. And as a learning person, my first thought was, I need this when we are piloting new programs. This is exactly what I need because I want to be able to wire somebody up and be able to say, hey, during that part of the course, they're super plugged in and engaged. And during that part of the course, they're not. So we're basically just wasting time. And so now we know where to make changes and where to make shifts. So was very excited about that. And we started using the technology for that purpose. But some of the things that we discovered was this. One of the first times that we used it, and actually, I should back up just a little bit to explain the immersion neuroscience philosophy. Paul's research and what his company does is it's based on the theory that the more immersed you are, and the way they define immersion is you are paying attention to something and you have emotional connection with it. That's what makes you immersed. And one of the very practical applications of that is for advertising. It's kind of like I just hinted at earlier, right? It was when somebody gets to that level of immersion, they are likely to follow up on the call to action that you're making in advertisement. So it's really useful for that. And they're doing that by measuring the amount of oxytocin in your bloodstream, which you can actually pick up through a few bio readings. So that's the idea of the technology there. The very first application that we did of this, we brought it into a in-person session for newly rising senior executives in our company. It was a day-long program, and we put it on them and we watched it through the whole thing. And one thing that we noticed was right about lunchtime, just before lunch, the person who was hosting it said, "Hey, we're going to stop for lunch, but we've got a special treat for you because we have a very senior leader in the company who just happens to be in town. They're going to come by." And during lunch, they're going to do a open, like a fireside chat type experience. Now, they did that. And I've seen this person present on the platform, and sometimes they are really, really good. And sometimes they really struggle to hold an audience. So I was a little not sure what's going to happen here. But we went into the session and I thought they were absolutely amazing, like top of the game. It was fantastic. And so I'm looking down at the real-time readings of people's immersion, and it was in the pits. It was the worst immersion of the entire day. And so then it's like, well, wait, what's going on with that? So of course we did some follow-up and we asked. And what we found was people were more concerned about, going to the sandwich bar and getting the sandwich spread and then coming back and eating. They were also concerned because the agenda that we had published said you're going to have an hour lunch break. And they had told their teams, hey, I'm going to check back with you during the lunch break. Some of them had set up calls during the lunch break. And now all of a sudden everything changed and they're having to scramble their plans. And that made them not immersed in the experience that really was out in front of them. So the lesson that I applied from that was Maslow's hierarchy always wins, right? Like if people are hungry, if they need to go to the bathroom, if it's getting to survival issues, they can't really dial into the higher level processing of what does the future look like for our company and what does the future look like for you. They're just worried about what am I going to eat? How am I going to take care of my people? All of that kind of stuff. It confirmed that for us. And I think Paul has quoted me on that several times, that they've learned from that Maslow's hierarchy always wins with keeping people engaged. The other thing that it did for us was, and we may get onto this a little bit later, my team has a set of what we call our durable learning principles of what are the factors that make good learning experiences. And the immersion neuroscience technology really confirmed that we were right. We pulled together a lot of research to come up with this list. We've been building all of our learning programs since then, trying to hit those targets of satisfying those principles. And what we've learned from that is when we do it, people tend to be immersed and engaged. And when we skip some of them, we tend to lose them. So it's been very, very interesting for us.
It's nice to have that real-time metric to identify those. And let's talk about some of those durable learning metrics because you're a learning geek as I am, and you have all this expertise in learning science. So if you could share some of those and share kind of the impact they have on the learning experience.
Yeah, and also I'm a learning geek of a certain age, so I have to lean over here and grab my sticky note because otherwise, I should have these all memorized by heart, but then I find like I always get on the spot and it's like, oh, I forget one of them,
Right.
so that gets frustrating. Okay. So tiny bit of background on the durable learning principles is our former chief learning officer, a good mentor of mine, Alison Horn, when she was working with us, she came to my team and said, what she wanted to do as she became the chief learning officer was really bring the science of learning into the classroom. So she asked my team to do research on neuroscience and the latest that we're finding out about learning theory and all of that kind of stuff to help us figure out how do we design learning that sticks, that makes it that is durable. Getting back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, Charles, right? Where you get to the end of a learning experience and you go back and your brains are so wired up to go back to the old way. How do we conquer those deep roots? And I used Make It Stick on purpose. That was one of the books that we used that was foundational in our research, but we did a lot of research on top of that. So we came up with these 8 principles. And here's what they are is it's for learning to stick, it needs to be relevant. So it needs to be something that the learner knows going into it is going to be useful for them. It needs to be engaging. And we were kind of just talking about that, right? I mean, the easiest way for me to understand engaging is if we can't keep people's attention, they're not even listening to what we say. So they're not learning anything. So it's got to be engaging. It's got to be contextual. So you have to have a learning experience and be able to hang it on the architecture of what you already know, to be able to put it in your own context. Absolutely essential. So we have to, when we're designing learning, provide opportunities for that, provide props for that to help people map it back to their own context. It's got to be effortful. If you don't have to work at all, if you don't need to try, you can kind of just hear something and go, oh yeah, okay, I learned that, I know that, and maybe you don't. You actually have to get pushed a little bit. It's got to be generative. So you have to take what you are learning and create something new from that, whether it's a recap of what you learned or you're actually creating a work product depending on what the course is. You got to do something to generate something. Social. So there is a lot to be said for what I would call single player learning, self studies, computer based training where it's just you or something. Like you can still get something out of that, but it's going to be more durable if there's some social component and you are conversing about, you're interacting with the content with other people and hearing what they have to say about it. You have to have spaced practice built into it, which is kind of double barreled. So the practice kind of gets back to the generative and the effortful. You need to do something while you're learning. So you've got to practice it. But the spaced comes in with it's got to be spaced out. I feel like I might be doing basic learning theory for some of your audience here, so I apologize if I sound pedantic here.
Well, no, because I think a lot of us, they kind of, they're used to in school doing cramming, right? And space learning is the opposite of cramming. So you can't study the night before and think you're going to ace an exam that tests you on deep conceptual topics like, math or science related. It didn't work then, it won't work now.
Right. Cramming is always the example that I use for this, so I'm glad you brought it up. But I'll challenge what you said just a little bit, Charles, because this is how I got through college. Is you can cram for that test and then you can succeed at the test. Great. You don't remember it like a day later. Right. So that's the whole thing. If I go back to college, right. So yeah. So again, it's all in the spirit of making it durable. So spaced practice, the spaced comes from you've got to be able to forget it a little bit before you practice again, because it's the relearning of it that is what actually builds the neural connections. And then the final one is reflection. That might be one of my favorite ones is to take the time just to sit and think after you learn something, what did I learn here? How am I going to apply this? What do I need to do differently? What more do I need to learn in order to apply it successfully moving forward? You've got to have that reflection built in. And that's one of the easiest things to skip in a learning experience. I find so many people design a reflection time into the end of a learning program, and then they find they're running out of time. So they're like, you know what? We're going to skip the reflection. Just do it at home. Then you lose it. So those are the durable learning principles. And we have found with those that as we started bringing those in and implementing them, our learning has been much more successful and people have retained their knowledge and been able to apply it moving forward.
I love that. And a lot of those cover, best practices in learning science, that space practice, retrieval practice, things that are not common because I find a lot of people, they don't learn how to learn. And that's a critical meta skill that I think every leader in this day and age really needs to pay attention to, because the faster you learn, the faster you earn. Things are constantly changing, and you have to be able to assimilate things faster, integrate them into your workflow, and be able to apply them. And I think that's what really separates a lot of times the great leaders from the average leaders is their ability to do so. Because questions, and one leader told me this once, he said, the question I always used to get is, how many books did I read? And I thought, that's such a poor question. It's really, how many of the books that I've read am I actually using and applying the information from? Because who cares how many I've read if I've forgotten about what I've read, or I look at the blink list shortly thereafter, that doesn't tell me anything. It's how much has the learning stuck, and how much have you applied as a result?
I love that. I love that. That actually gives me an opportunity to make a couple of plugs. A few weeks ago, Andrew Huberman released a couple of different podcasts about strategies for learning. It was really, I think, more targeted at like college students, but was so delighted to listen to those because everything he's saying lines up with the durable learning principles. So good job, Andrew. I don't know about you. He gets a little bit more numbers than I get on my podcasts,
Yeah,
but so that's
you
good.
got it.
That makes me feel good.
Yeah.
The other plug there is realizing that teaching people how to learn or how to learn better was something that's really important. A number of years ago, we created a video series at Accenture that we call Brain Hacks. And we initially released them internally for our own people, but we have since made them externally available. So that's something that anybody can take a look at. Feel free to use it with your own people, with your own company, give it to your kids. We do that with our kids too. Just go to YouTube and search for Accenture Brain Hacks, and you'll find it right there. So, yeah, learning to learn is great.
Yeah. Had Barbara Oakley on the program a little while ago, and she has the number one course on Udemy about mastering your learning, and some great books around that. And she mentions the importance really of mindset, because I think that gets in a way of learning sometimes. People think they're not good learners, or this has been painful in school, it's going to be painful now. And I don't think enough learning experiences or enough learning designers really account for that mindset. And Paul talked about it on the podcast with me as well, to say, they have to have the psychological safe space. You have to get them in the right mental state if you want them to engage, immerse themselves in the experience, and have takeaways as a result.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mindset is everything. And, even back to Carol Dweck's book on mindset, which is very famous. When I read that, it made me cry. I already said I cry at Kleenex commercials, but it did make me cry because I felt she was talking directly to me. As a young kid, I was gifted growing up, and I was rewarded for people telling me, "Oh, you're so smart. Oh, you already know everything that we're teaching in class." And I built my identity based on that. And in fifth grade, when I started struggling with long division, it wasn't just, wow, this is a struggle. This has now become a survival thing because I literally feel like I'm going to die. I was like a poster child for the fixed mindset. And, fortunately, I grew up a little bit over those years and realized, yeah, I still have a lot to learn. But reading Carol Dweck's book and realizing everybody can grow. Everybody is still malleable. And then looking at the neuroscience and realizing that the brain is not fixed at all, but is always neuroplastic. It's fundamental.
Yeah, that such a foundational work. Having that growth mindset is so essential to take into any learning experience. And learning in the flow of work is a major trend these days. And Microsoft recently launched Copilot that's kind of integrating more of that AI piece into the Office applications. But what are some effective strategies that you found that work for implementing learning seamlessly into daily tasks? We do quite a bit here at IMS too with the micro learning, the AI driven nudges, coaching. But talk to me more kind of about your approach and what you've seen that really works well.
Yeah, I feel like we're talking the same language there. We really started looking at this probably about 3 years ago. Our chief learning officer at that time realized it was fundamental for us that we were going to have people do learning in the flow of work. He called it work learn fusion. Needed to bring those things together. So my team and a few other people were tasked with, yeah, how do we do this? How do we make it work? So we started doing a whole bunch of research. And what we found is all roads lead back to Bob and Con. And by that, I mean Bob Mosier and Conrad Gottfredson with Apply Synergies, who did a lot of the foundational work in learning in the flow of work. They talk about the 5 moments of need. As we started going down various rabbit holes on this, it all wound up pointing back to Bob and Con. And fortunately, we know Bob and Con and we're friends with Bob and Con. So we were able to have those conversations with them. And we really adopted that. We wound up kind of pivoting the 5 moments of need into our own slightly adapted model where we say when we think about a total learning experience, we think there is what we call the formal ingredient of it. And the formal ingredient of it, it could be something very formal, like, we're going to fly everybody all over the world to a place to sit in a classroom and learn together. Or formal could even be like a self-paced learning that you do on a computer by yourself. But it's just kind of the time away to learn, that devoted time. But then we needed to supplement that a little bit before and then a lot after with more, what do we need to do to support people when they actually need to apply it on their job, right? That's the third moment of need that Bob and Con talk about. During the class, that's where they learn for the first time, or sometimes they learn more. But when they need to apply it, that's where the rubber is really hitting the road. So we use and we have found successful, a lot of the same strategies that you're talking about: micro learning, coaching, performance support. If you talk to Bob and Con, they are very focused on having a live performance coach that is there for you on the back end as you're learning something, and that makes it work. I actually, and this is very funny to a lot of people, especially, you can see in the background, I've got an arcade machine in my room. I'm a passionate gamer. I'm not a fan of gamification. And let me walk that back just a little bit, because I love to shock people with that, but let me walk it back a little bit. Um, Games for learning. So creating a game that helps somebody learn something, I think, is one of the most effective tools that we have. I was trying for years to start calling that playable learning to differentiate it from gamification, but I had trouble actually making that become a thing. Interesting conversation with Carl Kopp at one ATD, where we had a conversation about that. But I still believe that, like, having a game experience to help somebody learn, incredibly effective. But gamification, if you look it up at the dictionary, and it's the applying of game mechanics to tasks and jobs that you ordinarily would do, I have some challenges with that. So I don't like points. I don't like leaderboards. I don't like badges. And the main reason I think of that is I think it winds up being extrinsic motivation that you start running into people who will engage in what you want them to engage in just for the purpose of getting the badge, or just for the purpose of going to the top of the points and doing the competition. And it's almost like cramming. They might be able to spout back what they learned at the end, but they're never going to apply it. They're never going to make it work. I believe there's no better intrinsic motivation than you got to do something on the job. And so, bringing it to that point of, let's get to the point where somebody has learned something, they've learned the basics, now they get back to the job and they've got to apply it. Great. How do we support them through that?
Before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about the future of learning. And What are some of the biggest gaps you see in corporate learning today?
Two things. One of the biggest gaps I have is kind of where we started, is with what really is the objective. And so even though I'm seeing a lot of progress on this and I'm very excited about that, I do still think we have too many learning professionals, too many learning programs that are, the way they measure success is with attendance and satisfaction. And having to remember, like, no, the reason that we are doing this is because we want business results. And yes, to be able to measure that to see how effective you are. We're very fortunate at Accenture in that we know that our leadership believes that learning is important. So I feel like even if we weren't able to demonstrate the business impact that we were having, it still would be something that was important to us. But the rigor of thinking through that, what are the business outcomes that I'm trying to achieve? What are the metrics that are going to tell me that? And then how am I going to design learning objectives that are going to help people engage in the behaviors that we want them to do that are going to lead to these business results? That's what learning is all about. So if you're not already there, listen to me, listen to Jim Kirkpatrick, listen to almost everybody else who is saying we got to be focused on business performance, which is great.
And that learning and development needs to be changed to learning and performance. When he told me that, yeah, I'm a believer, and I'm a converted, part of the following now. So yeah, it didn't take much for me either.
The second thing is, and I cannot believe that we have gone almost an hour here and we have not used the letters AI. Um, because like that seems to be what everybody is focused on. But the interesting story with that, Charles, is a couple of years ago, my team, we get together for a live in-person summit every year, retreat, but also planning and reflection and the type of things you do on a corporate retreat. I say that having just watched an episode of Severance where they all went on a corporate retreat, and I'm like, it's not going to be that type of retreat. But um, when we a couple of years ago, we did this retreat, and so this would be like August of 2022, right? Um, and I said, let's spend some time and let's think about what is learning going to look like in 2035, because we had a whole bunch of initiatives at Accenture that were focused on 2025. But I said, what about 2035? What do we think learning is going to look like? Like, let's go back to crazy ideas, sci-fi books we've read, all that kind of stuff. We brainstormed, we came up with a whole bunch of sticky notes, clustered them. I took that cluster and I came back and I wrote like a 14-page sci-fi story of the day in the life of an Accenture person um, in 2035. And I'm not going to bore you with the whole story, but I'll just kind of give you the highlights of it. The idea was, consultant wakes up in the morning, she puts on her smart glasses, which put a data layer on top of the real world. And as soon as she puts on her glasses, she sees her AI coach walk in the room and say, "Thank God you're up. You got a call overnight from your client, the banking client. They had a cybersecurity hack and they need our help to fix it. They have asked to talk to you this afternoon. So I canceled your entire schedule for the morning so you can prep for that, because you are not as up to speed on what's going on in cybersecurity as you think you are. So the first thing you're going to do is, I've created a video for you that is going to help you understand the gaps. You're going to watch that. Then we're going to role play the conversation with the client. Based on that, I'm going to match you up with a few other Accenture experts. And I've already talked to their AI agents. So like they're ready for you to make sure that you get the coaching you need. Then you're going to have the meeting. I will be there. I will take notes. I'll give you feedback afterwards. We'll make it go. So we come up with this story. And then at the end of it, my coworker, Ben, who is probably the techier one of all of us, said, this is really cool, but I don't see this happening by 2035. Like, this is going to need advances in AI and VR that I just don't see on the horizon. Well, I was very careful to set up when this actually happened, right? It was 2 months later that ChatGPT came out. It was 2 months after that Apple unveiled, their vision for the Vision Pro, which that product isn't really taking off, but you saw where we were getting to with what Meta just rolled out last year, what they prototyped last year. It's going in that direction. And we realized after about 6 months of looking at this that it probably wasn't Learning 2035. It probably was 20, maybe 26 that we're going to have that. We're going to get the AI component of that faster than I think we're going to get the AR, although that is cleaning up. But just two quick things about that story is it was very affirming to me in that even though we created that story on our own, we're not the only people who have created that story. Like I've heard from lots of experts who tell similar stories, and I know they didn't read what I wrote or talk to me about it. So it's not a unique vision, even though I think it's an exciting, compelling vision. And since we started playing with this 2 years ago, nothing has dissuaded me that that is the direction that we're ultimately going towards. So we're taking step by step, we're getting down that path. I think a lot of the work that Sal Khan did with Khan Academy and the Khan Migo in terms of let's make an AI that isn't just an information dispenser, but actually is a Socratic tutor that makes sure that you learn as well as getting the facts that you need. Brilliant. All heading down that path. And so that's where I think learning is going. It's going to be more individual. I think there is a future where we don't have courses, we don't have curricula. It's tailor-made for each individual learner in the moment to satisfy their needs.
I agree with you. I mean, I am full support of that and believe that's coming sooner than we think. The AI-powered learning assistants providing that real-time coaching, and I think it's going to transform learning into a continuous, intelligent experience rather than a one-time event, which is going to be so critical and get that learning to stick. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, Bob Gerard, BOB-GERARD. That's probably the best way for most of your listeners to listen. I am also the co-host of the Learning Geeks podcast. So you can find us at learninggeekspod.com, and then that will have links to your podcast vendor of choice, or just search for the Learning Geeks. And for the, I promised I was going to bring it back up again. It only came up once. For the small subset of your audience who is also passionate about Star Wars, like I am, my other podcast is called Short for a Stormtrooper, a 15-minute Star Wars podcast. So I started that about a year ago. And what I realized was I really like listening to podcasts, but most of the time I listen to podcasts is when I'm cleaning the kitchen. And that takes about 15 minutes. And so I have to, break it up into parts. I said, let's do a Star Wars podcast that's only 15 minutes. So that's the pitch. Would welcome anybody there. So that for that, just search on your podcast vendor, Spotify or YouTube or whatever, for Short for a Stormtrooper, and you'll find me there.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.